Now, after they did that, what did they do? Well, they saw that they were naked, they were ashamed, and so they went and hid from God. Now, they were not made, their purpose in being created was not to hide from God, but rather to enjoy fellowship with Him, correct? To be in His presence. So by virtue of hiding from Him, by being apart from Him, they were falling short of their purpose, and that is sin. And so they're hiding, they're being ashamed. That is what sin is. It's coming up short of their purpose. And then finally, iniquity in that whole account is the fact that while they loved God, they loved themselves more. And so iniquity was a love for self above a love for God. And it was that iniquity, that love for self, that overarching love for self that caused them to sin in the first place. So that's iniquity. So just in that little story, you see transgression, sin, and iniquity. But let's first consider transgression. Because I think this is one that for most of us, we most readily identify with sin and ungodliness. Transgression is not coming up short. You can't say transgression is making a mistake. Okay? Which a lot of times, you'll hear people say, well, I just made a mistake. Or I tripped up. That is not a transgression. There is tripping up. There is making mistakes. There is coming up short. But that's not transgression. Transgression is rebellion. Okay? Pure and simple. Transgression is a willful act of disobedience. You know what is wrong, you know what is right, and you choose the wrong. You cannot be put in jail for being lazy, but you can be put in jail for stealing. Okay? Both of them are wrong, both of them are poor, but only one of them is punishable by jail. It is stealing that is the transgression here. Laziness would be the sin. Okay? Both are ungodly, but the cure or the fix for one is different than the other. Now, Augustine said that sin is the punishment of sin. And he's right. And what he was saying is that inherent in our rebellion comes an anxiety and an anxiousness and a misery that is in itself its own punishment. And you could ask Adam and Eve, and they'd agree with you, or they'd agree with Augustine, that for them, that act of rebellion, while it gave them temporary freedom from God, and while it gave them the knowledge of good and evil, it gave them more than those things, misery and shame and anxiety and a life of hardship. Rebels make for miserable people. And so when David here says, blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, what he's saying is that there is a blessing in misery, because that blessing is the fact that misery leads us to confession. And that is the whole point of transgression, and that's the cure for transgression. If you have committed a sin willfully, and I know all of you have, and there may be something on your balance sheet that is yet to be cleared, that's been on your balance sheet for years, or weeks, or months, or days, or this morning, or a morning 30 years ago, I don't know. But if there is something on your balance sheet that is outstanding, that you have not confessed, there is no way to find blessing. You will not be a blessed person. You cannot find that blessing unless that misery that has been produced in your life because of that transgression, that stepping across a boundary, is confessed. Rebellion, if you were to ask, what did Satan look for in Adam and Eve to get them to make the decision to eat of that fruit? He looked for the pride in them, because that's what he used. That's the asset that Adam and Eve had that Satan was able to draw on. And it's true for you too. It is pride that leads us to rebellion. And it's pride that makes us an enemy of God. It's pride that makes us an enemy of each other. When I was in high school, I lied to my mother. And I lied rather blatantly and boldly. But she didn't know it. Okay? But I lied with authority. I promise you about this way. And after I lied to her, I was a Christian at the time. And I needed God at the time as well. And I was trying to enjoy time with Him. I really needed Him. And I was going to my prayer closet every day. And I think I've told you about this somewhat before. God continued to bring up to me the fact that I had lied to my mother. And I asked for forgiveness of God. I looked at Psalm 51 when David said, I've sinned only against you, God, and it's you alone that I've sinned against. And so I said, well, I asked your forgiveness for lying to my mother, and that wasn't good enough for God. But that wasn't good enough for me either. So I remember one day I was driving with my father, and this was really bugging me, and I wanted to ask my dad about it without asking my dad about it. And as we were driving down the road, I saw that we passed a field that was posted. The field was full of no trespassing signs. So I got it in my head. I know I can ask him. So I said, Dad, suppose that I went to this man's field and I traipsed all throughout these woods, knowing that I was not supposed to trespass. I saw the posted signs. But I walked all throughout these woods. And then I left, and afterward I felt badly about it. Should I pray to God and ask for forgiveness? Or do I need to go to the owner of the property and to ask him for forgiveness? Who should I confess to? And my dad thought for a second, and he said, well, I don't think it's an either-or question, John. You need to confess to both. You need to ask forgiveness of both. And I thought, that's not a good answer. But I didn't want to keep pressing it because then I knew that he probably knew he was, you don't ask questions like that for nothing. But anyway, my dad was right. I had confessed to God and I had received assurance that God had forgiven me, but I needed to confess to my mother as well, and I did. And I felt like $1,000,000. If you read any Christian literature, whether it be Scarlet Letter, Crime and Punishment, Anna Karenina, all those stories, the prodigal son, the great part of the story of the prodigal son is the fact that the misery was overcome when he gave up, when he surrendered. We're all rooting for the prodigal son when he gets the money and goes and lives in a wild life, and you're hoping it works out for him. But then you see when he's eating pig slop, or he's hoping to eat pig slop, but he doesn't even have pig slop, you're like, man, your life is miserable, guy. You need to go home. And we all come to the conclusion the prodigal son does. Before he gets there, you're like, wow, there's no reason for you to be living like this. You should really go home. And so the point of misery, which transgression always leads us to misery, it always makes us anxious and miserable, is that it leads us to the wonderful thing, the wonderful moment of confession, of surrender, where you say to yourself, you know what? I don't care how much pride I have. I don't care how much it's going to cost. I want to be free of this misery, and the only way to be free of it is to confess. And in confession, there is forgiveness. And so he says, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven. And so if you're being plagued today by some transgression, it's pointless for you to try to have that transgression covered. As we're going to see, covering is what happens for sin. The only way to have the transgression taken care of in your life is through confession. And so, just as there are different forms of ungodliness, there are different forms of cure. And so the first thing that you have to note from this is that forgiveness comes through confession, through that surrender. Well, the next blessing that David remarks about here is the blessing that comes in change. It's the blessing in having sins covered. Look at the second part of verse 1. He says, by extension, how blessed is the one whose sin is covered. Whose sin is covered. Let's now consider for just a moment the idea of sin. Sin, as I remarked at the start, is missing the mark. That's the famous definition